At my 62nd birthday party, a plane circled overhead with a banner, "Happy Birthday to a useless old man who doesn't deserve happiness." My son live-streamed it and laughed, "Just wait, Dad. The best part is coming." Then his wife grabbed the microphone and told nearly 100 guests he's being manipulated by a woman who only wants his assets. The whole backyard went silent. I only held my wife's hand tighter, swallowed the humiliation, and made one quiet promise every one of them would pay. "If you made it to this moment, I am grateful for you. Tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country." That one comment connects us more than you think. One thing worth mentioning: parts of this story are fictional, shaped for educational and storytelling purposes. Names and places are coincidental, but what this story teaches you is something I genuinely hope stays with you. My name is Raymond Calloway. I turned 62 years old on a Saturday morning in early July, and I celebrated that milestone the same way I'd celebrated most mornings for the past 4 decades, alone in my garage with a cup of black coffee going cold on the workbench and a stack of folders spread out under the fluorescent light. People who knew me from the shop used to joke that I was the only mechanic in Nashville who kept his paperwork cleaner than his engine bays. They weren't wrong. 31 years of running Callaway's Auto on Harding Pike taught me one thing above everything else: a man without his documents is a man without a defense. I'd seen customers lose warranty claims because they threw away a receipt. I'd watched business partners get burned because they trusted a handshake over a contract. I never made either mistake. Every lease agreement, every insurance renewal, every signed estimate filed, dated, backed up. My wife used to tease me about it. Said I kept more records than the county courthouse. She passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer. 17 months from diagnosis to the last morning I held her hand. After that, the garage kept me sane. The smell of motor oil and the weight of a torque wrench, those things didn't ask anything from me. They just waited. That morning, though, I wasn't reaching for a wrench. I was sitting with a manila folder I'd labeled in my own handwriting, "Derek Financial Help." Inside were copies of documents I'd accumulated over 3 years, co-signed loan paperwork, a personal guarantee I'd added my name to when Derek's company needed a line of credit to survive its first rough quarter, a lease agreement for a commercial vehicle, a box truck his company used for equipment hauling, where my name appeared as the secondary guarantor because the lender didn't trust Derek's credit profile alone. I'd helped him because he was my son. That's what fathers do. At least that's what I believed then. I closed the folder when my phone buzzed on the workbench. The message was from Derek. "Dad, don't be late. Big surprise today. You're gonna love it." I read it twice. Something about the phrasing, not "we have a surprise," but "you're gonna love it," sat wrong in my stomach. Derek had never been the sentimental type. He didn't plan things to make other people feel good. He planned things to make himself look good. I set the phone down, finished the last of my cold coffee, and went inside to change. My wife, my new wife Margaret, was already dressed when I came upstairs. We'd been married 11 months, introduced through mutual friends at our church congregation, and she was the quietest kind of strong I'd ever encountered. She'd raised 2 daughters on her own after her first husband walked out, built a small alterations business from nothing, and never once asked anyone to feel sorry for her. When I told her about Derek's complicated feelings toward our marriage, she hadn't flinched. "He'll come around," she'd said. "Or he won't. Either way, we'll be fine." She was adjusting an earring when I walked in, and she looked at me the way she always did, like she was reading something just beneath the surface of my face. "You look like a man who already knows today is going to be difficult," she said. "I look like a man who's been wrong before," I told her. "Let's hope I'm wrong again." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes all the way. Derek's house was a 40-minute drive east into a newer subdivision where the lawns were manicured and the driveways held trucks that cost more than my first home. By the time we arrived, the backyard was already full. Balloons blue and silver reading 62 floated above the patio. The smell of charcoal and brisket hung in the warm July air. Neighbors, cousins, a few men from Derek's business circle, some faces I recognized from family Christmases past, and phones. More phones than I'd ever noticed at a family gathering. People weren't just carrying them, they were holding them outward, angled like everyone had silently agreed to document the afternoon. Derek met us at the gate. He was 41 years old, built like a man who'd played college ball and never quite let go of the identity. He shook my hand, firm practiced, and gave Margaret a smile that didn't match his eyes. "Glad you made it," he said. Then to Margaret, "Good to see you again, Carol." Her name was not Carol. Margaret's jaw tightened for exactly 1 second. Then she smiled graciously and said nothing. I noted it. I noted everything. Emily, Derek's wife, materialized beside him, like she'd been waiting just out of frame. She was dressed sharply, the kind of outfit that said this had been planned. She air-kissed Margaret's cheek and murmured, "Love the dress." Very practical. 2 words. That's all it took for me to understand the tone of the afternoon. The next hour passed in the way bad things often do, slowly enough that you keep telling yourself it'll get better, quickly enough that you don't realize how deep in you are until the exits are behind you. I shook hands and accepted birthday wishes. I ate a plate of food I don't remember tasting. I watched Emily whisper to the caterer, adjust the speaker setup, check something on her phone 3 separate times. And I watched Derek. He kept finding reasons to drift toward the center of the yard, toward the open sky above the patio. At one point he looked up just briefly, with an expression I can only describe as anticipation. Then he leaned toward me close enough that only I could hear, and said 4 words in a low voice. "Wait for it, Dad." I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I felt it somewhere between my ribs and my better judgment that whatever came next was not going to be a birthday cake. I didn't have to wait long. The sound came first, a low droning hum that rolled in from the south, like distant thunder that couldn't quite commit to a storm. A few guests looked up instinctively. Someone near the drink table shaded their eyes. I followed their gaze toward the open sky above Derek's backyard, and that's when I saw it. A small plane, white against the blue July afternoon, banking in a wide arc over the neighborhood, and trailing behind it in letters tall enough to read from 300 feet below, a banner snapping in the wind. "Happy birthday to a useless old man who doesn't deserve happiness." The yard went silent, the way a room goes silent when someone says the unspeakable thing out loud, not just quiet, but hollowed out. Children stopped running. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman near the fence actually gasped, and the sound of it carried across the whole patio like a dropped glass. I stood very still. The plane circled. The banner came around a second time lower, now the letters impossible to misread. And I heard it, Derek's laugh. Low, controlled, the kind of laugh a man makes when a plan goes exactly right. I turned toward him slowly. He was standing 10 feet away with his phone raised, the screen facing outward. Recording. Live streaming. His expression was the one I'd seen on his face since he was a teenager, the look of a man who believed he was winning. Margaret's hand found my arm. Her fingers pressed in, not out of fear, but to anchor me. I could feel her pulse against my skin, fast and tight. "Raymond," she said quietly. "Just my name. Nothing else needed." I covered her hand with mine and didn't move. The banner made a third pass before the plane finally climbed and banked away to the north. By then, the yard had divided itself without anyone saying a word. Half the guests stood frozen faces, cycling through shock and embarrassment. The other half, the ones Derek had clearly briefed, wore expressions of practiced neutrality, the look of people who knew what was coming and had decided to let it happen. Emily was smiling. Not broadly, she was smarter than that. Just the corners of her mouth, a private satisfaction she couldn't quite suppress. She reached for the wireless microphone that had been sitting on the patio table this entire time. I noticed then that it hadn't been there for music. It had been there for this. She tapped it once. The soft thud carried across the yard. "Cocktail, before we cut the cake," she said, her voice warm and measured the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about our family." Someone nearby shifted uncomfortably. A cousin of mine, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who'd driven up from Murfreesboro, muttered something under his breath and looked at his shoes. Emily continued. "We love Raymond. We do. But love means being honest. And the truth is, there are things about this woman." She gestured toward Margaret without looking at her directly, the way you gesture at an object rather than a person, that Raymond doesn't know. Things that affect all of us. Margaret's hand tightened on my arm. I felt it. I also felt something shift inside my own chest. Not anger exactly. Anger was too hot for what this was. This was colder, more deliberate. The kind of feeling you get when you finally understand something you'd been trying not to see. Derek stepped forward slightly. His voice came out smooth, concerned the performance of a dutiful son. "Dad, we're not trying to ruin your day. We just care about you. You've worked your whole life for what you have, and we don't want to see you taken advantage of." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I spoke, not loudly, not with any heat in my voice, just clearly in the tone I used when I was telling a customer their engine had a cracked block and there was no fixing it cheap. "Derek," I said, "I spent 31 years in a garage. You know what I learned? A man who hides what he's doing while he's doing it isn't protecting anyone. He's just making sure there are no witnesses." The yard was still. Even Emily's smile flickered. "I also learned," I continued, "that the louder a man talks about what he's owed, the less he understands about what he's earned." I put my hand gently on Margaret's back. She stood perfectly straight beside me, her chin level, her expression composed, in a way that cost her something. I could see it in her eyes, not humiliation, but exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been underestimated so many times that it has stopped being a surprise and started being a weight. "We're leaving," I said. Not to Derek, not to Emily. To myself, really, as confirmation of a decision I'd already made somewhere between the second pass of that banner and the moment Emily picked up the microphone. I shook two hands on the way out Gerald's, and an old neighbor named Bill, who grabbed my arm and said in a voice thick with something I didn't have time to name, "Ray, I'm sorry, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I told him. The drive home took 40 minutes. Margaret and I didn't speak much. There was a kind of companionable silence between us that wasn't empty. It was full of things we were each processing privately, the way two people do when they've been through something together and need a moment before they can name it. She made tea when we got home. I went to the garage. I don't know exactly why I reached for that manila folder again. Habit, maybe. Or some instinct that the afternoon had been about more than humiliation, that there was a practical dimension underneath the performance, a reason beyond cruelty. I spread the documents across the workbench under the fluorescent light. The lease agreement for Derek's box truck, the personal guarantee, the co-signed credit line. I turned to the addendum page, the extension that had been filed 9 months ago to stretch the lease term another year. My signature was there, neat and clear, exactly where it was supposed to be. Except I didn't remember signing it. I picked up the page and held it closer to the light. The signature looked like mine. It had the right general shape, the familiar loop on the C, the flat line through the double L. But something about the pressure was wrong. The ink sat differently on the page, too, even too consistent, like something produced rather than written, like something that had been copied from another document and placed here. My stomach dropped about 3 inches. I set the page down carefully, the way you set down something you're not sure is stable, and stood there in the quiet of my own garage with the fluorescent light humming above me, and the realization forming slowly the way a diagnosis forms, not all at once, but piece by piece, each piece worse than the one before it. This afternoon hadn't just been about embarrassing me in front of my friends and family. There was something else underneath it. Something that had been built quietly over months while I wasn't looking. And whatever it was, it had my name on it. I stood at that workbench for a long time. The fluorescent light hummed its steady, indifferent hum. The garage smelled the way it always had: motor oil and old rubber and the particular metallic cold of tools that had been handled 10,000 times. These were the smells of my working life, the smells of certainty and competence. I had never once doubted my hands in this garage, but that signature on the page made me doubt my memory. I pulled out 2 other documents from the folder, the original lease agreement from 3 years ago, and a routine service authorization I'd signed for Derek's truck last spring. I laid all 3 side by side under the light and studied them the way I used to study an engine schematic before a rebuild, methodically, without rushing to a conclusion. The original lease signature was mine. I could feel it, the slight rightward lean, the way the second L in Callaway dragged just a fraction before lifting. The service authorization matched. Both had the small imperfections that come from a real hand moving in real time. The addendum signature was different. Not dramatically, whoever had produced it was careful. But the pressure was too consistent. The ink distribution was too uniform. It looked like a signature that had been studied and then reproduced, rather than one that had been written. Like the difference between a photograph of a fire and an actual flame. I took photos of all 3 documents with my phone. Then I placed them back in the folder, closed it, and went inside. Margaret was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. She looked up when I came in, and whatever she saw in my face made her set the cup down carefully. "Tell me," she said. So I did. I laid it out the way I would explain a mechanical problem, plainly in sequence without dramatizing it. The addendum. The signature. The feeling that something had been placed in my name without my knowledge. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Raymond," she said finally, "how long has Derek had access to your personal documents?" I thought about it. "Long enough," I said. "He helped me move some files when I had that back surgery 2 years ago. He would have seen where everything was kept." She nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow morning you call Frank." She was right. Frank DeLuca had been my closest friend for going on 26 years. We'd met at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast, back when I was trying to figure out whether to incorporate the garage, and he'd been a certified public accountant and part-time notary for most of his career before retiring. He wasn't a practicing attorney, but he understood contracts and financial documents the way I understood engines from the inside out. More importantly, he understood how people exploited paperwork, because he'd spent decades watching them try. I called him at 7:15 Sunday morning. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd already been awake. "Ray," he said. "I heard about yesterday. Gerald called me last night. Then you know I need to talk. Merle's Diner, 8:30. I'll bring the reading glasses." Merle's was a narrow booth and counter place on Charlotte Pike that had been serving the same breakfast menu since before either of us had gray hair. Frank was already in the back booth when I arrived, a legal pad open on the table in front of him and 2 coffees already poured. He was 70 years old, broad-shouldered, with the careful eyes of a man who had spent a career noticing what other people missed. I slid the folder across the table without preamble. He put on his reading glasses and went through each document slowly, holding the addendum page up toward the window light, the same way I had held it under the fluorescent. "Tell me what you feel when you look at it," he said, without looking up. "It looks like mine," I said, "but it doesn't feel like mine. The ink is wrong." He set the page down. "You're not imagining it. The pressure distribution is too even. A real signature has micro-variations, tiny inconsistencies in how hard the pen presses at different points. This one doesn't have those." He tapped the page. "This was either traced from a scan or produced digitally and printed onto the document. Can I prove that?" "No, a forensic document examiner can prove it. That's a professional who analyzes handwriting and ink under laboratory conditions. It's a legitimate field used in courts across the country. What you have here is enough to justify requesting that examination." He paused. "But Ray, before we get to proving anything, we need to understand the full picture. Pull out everything that has your name connected to Derek's business." We spent the next 90 minutes going through the folder line by line. Frank made notes in his careful, compressed handwriting. By the time the coffee pot had been refilled twice, we had a working list of concerns, not accusations, just questions that needed answering. "Here's what I need you to understand," Frank said, capping his pen. "You don't go at this by calling Derek and confronting him. That gets you a scene, and scenes are editable. What you do is move quietly. No texts, no arguments, no threats. You gather, you verify. You let the paperwork speak. And Derek's company, the lease," Frank leaned forward slightly. "That's actually where this gets interesting. I want you to look at something." He pointed to a clause midway through the original lease, a standard provision I'd read at signing, but hadn't thought about since. It required that any driver operating the leased vehicle maintain current valid insurance and be listed as an authorized operator on the policy. If Derek changed, drivers added employees, let anyone operate that truck who wasn't listed on the insurance policy at the time, that's a breach of the lease terms, Frank said. It doesn't matter whether the fraud is proven yet. A breach of the insurance or authorized driver clause alone can trigger a default procedure under the contract, meaning the leasing company can act independently, meaning the leasing company has its own interests to protect. And if they find out their collateral has been operating outside the policy terms, they don't need your permission to start their own process. He folded his hands on the table. You don't have to be the hammer, Ray. You just have to put the right information in front of the right people. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, a family walked past the diner window, two kids arguing over something, parents not paying attention, ordinary Sunday morning life continuing without any awareness of what was being quietly assembled 2 feet from the glass. "What's the first step?" I asked. "Document preservation," Frank said. "Tonight you photograph every page. Back it up in 2 places, cloud, and a drive you keep off-site. Don't move anything, don't alter anything. Then Monday you call an attorney. A real one, not a retired CPA having breakfast with you." He almost smiled. "I can give you a name," I nodded. I picked up the addendum page one final time, looked at that signature, careful, clean, and completely wrong, and placed it back in the folder. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me with the expression he used when he wanted to make sure something landed. "Ray," he said, "if that signature turns out to be what we think it is, this isn't just a family dispute anymore." I didn't answer right away. I was thinking about Derek's face at the party, that look of anticipation when he glanced at the sky. The phone raised and recording. The microphone already on the table. My phone buzzed against my thigh. I looked at the screen. A message from Derek. "Tomorrow noon, my place. We need to talk, Dad. I set the phone face down on the table without responding. Whatever Derek wanted to say at that lunch, I intended to hear it very carefully and remember every word. The message from Derek sat on my phone unanswered, all through Sunday afternoon. Margaret found me in the kitchen around 3 o'clock, staring at a glass of water I hadn't touched. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down with the quiet deliberateness of a woman who had decided something was going to be said. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about why yesterday didn't break me the way they expected it to." I looked at her. "You don't have to explain yourself to me, Margaret." "I know I don't." She folded her hands on the table. "That's exactly why I want to." She told me then, not dramatically, not with tears, just plainly, about her first marriage. Her ex-husband had been charming in public and corrosive in private, the kind of man who used love as a leash and generosity as a ledger. By the time she understood what was happening, her name had been tied to 3 financial decisions she hadn't fully understood, and extracting herself had cost her 2 years and most of her savings. "I learned something from that," she said. "The people who want to control you will always find a way to frame it as protection. Derek stood up there yesterday and called it love. Emily called it honesty." She paused. "It was neither." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. So here's what I'm asking." She looked at me directly the way she always did when she meant something completely. "Every time we meet with Derek or Emily from this point forward, every phone call, every visit, I want a witness or a recording. Not because I'm afraid of them, because I refuse to be misquoted." It was the most practical thing anyone had said to me in 24 hours, and it settled something in my chest that had been loose since the night before. "Agreed," I said. We spent the rest of the afternoon making a list. Not an angry list, a careful one. Every person at that party who might have recorded the banner, the microphone moment, the expressions on Derek's and Emily's faces when it all unfolded. Frank had been clear. Original video files carried metadata, embedded timestamp, and location data that gave them far greater legal weight than a screenshot or a re-recorded clip. We needed the source files, not copies. I made 6 calls. 4 went to voicemail, 2 picked up. The first was a woman named Donna Hartwell, a neighbor of Derek's who had attended the party, and who I learned had been quietly horrified by what she witnessed. She had recorded the banner on her phone out of sheer disbelief. "Raymond," she said, her voice carrying the particular warmth of someone who felt guilty for having been present. "I didn't know any of that was planned. I couldn't believe what I was seeing." "I know, Donna. I'm not asking you to take a side. I'm just asking if you'd be willing to share the original file." A brief silence. "Yes. I'll send it right now." The second call was to a man named Curtis Webb, an old acquaintance from my church, who had been standing near the back of the yard with his teenage son. Curtis had recorded the entire microphone segment on a newer phone with good audio quality. He transferred the file without hesitation. "That woman had no business talking about Margaret that way," he said flatly. "None." By early evening, Margaret and I had 4 video files saved to my phone and backed up to a cloud account I had created that morning using a new email address. Each file was original, unedited, with full metadata intact. We watched them together at the kitchen table side by side without commentary. The banner footage from Donna's phone was clear enough that the words were fully legible. But it was Curtis's clip that stopped us both. Emily was standing at the microphone, her voice smooth and projected entirely in control of her performance. And then, in a moment, she clearly hadn't anticipated being captured at that angle. She turned slightly toward a woman standing nearby and said quietly, but well within the microphone's range, 4 words that the audio picked up without distortion. "She's after the assets." Margaret heard it and went very still. I reached over and pressed pause. The frame froze on Emily's face, composed, deliberate, the face of someone who believed she was managing a situation rather than exposing herself. "That's defamation," I said quietly. In American law, defamation means making a false statement of fact about someone to a third party in a way that damages their reputation. Emily had just done exactly that in front of 90 people with a live microphone. That statement is false, it was made publicly, and it caused harm. That's the legal definition. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I want you to send that clip to Frank tonight." Already planned on it. She stood up, moved to the sink, and stood with her back to me for a few seconds. When she turned around, her expression had shifted not to anger, but to something harder and cleaner than anger. "Raymond," she said, "I didn't marry you to be a problem for your family to solve. I married you because you're a decent man who deserved someone in his corner." She held my gaze. "So let me be in your corner. All the way." I forwarded the clip to Frank with a short note. Then I backed up every file one more time to a portable drive I locked in the garage safe, the same safe where I kept my most important shop documents, the one whose combination only I knew. I was closing the safe when I heard Margaret call from the front of the house. Her voice was careful, controlled the voice she used when she didn't want to alarm me but needed me present. I walked to the front door. She was standing in the open doorway holding a plain white envelope that had been left on the porch. No stamp, no return address, just my name written in block letters on the front. Inside was a printed screenshot of Derek's live stream from the party, and below it a single typed line. "Your dad is a joke. The whole town knows it now." I stood there reading it twice. Then I looked up at Margaret. "Keep it," I said. "Bag it, don't fold it. Everything they send us is something they're giving us." She nodded and went to find a Ziploc bag. I stayed in the doorway a moment longer, looking out at the quiet Sunday street, thinking about what Frank had said, that I didn't have to be the hammer. I just had to put the right information in front of the right people. Tomorrow was Monday, and I had a lunch appointment I intended to walk into fully prepared. Frank had made the call Sunday evening while I was backing up the video files. By 7:30 Monday morning, I was sitting across from a woman named Patricia Owens in a downtown Nashville office on 4th Avenue. Patricia was a civil litigation attorney, mid-50s, precise, in the way that people who argue for a living tend to become precise, with a habit of letting silence do the work that lesser lawyers filled with noise. Frank had known her for 15 years and trusted her the way he trusted his own accounting completely, and with documentation. I laid everything on her desk. The folder, the addendum page with the questionable signature, the video files on a thumb drive, the Ziploc bag containing the anonymous envelope, the notes Frank and I had written on a legal pad at Merle's Diner. She went through each item without speaking. When she finished, she set her pen down and looked at me. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I want to be clear about what we can and cannot do today. What you have here is sufficient to justify 3 immediate actions. First, a preserve evidence notice to your son and his business. This is a formal legal demand requiring them to retain all documents, communications, and records related to any agreement bearing your name. Destroying or altering those materials after receiving this notice could expose them to serious legal consequences. Second, a cease and desist regarding the defamatory statements made publicly about your wife. Third, a formal records request to the leasing company for every document associated with your guarantor status. The original lease, every addendum, every payment record, every insurance filing. Can you have those ready before noon?" She almost smiled. "Frank told me you'd ask that. I started drafting last night." I left her office at 9:15 with copies of all 3 documents in a folder and the originals already dispatched by certified mail and email. A cease and desist, properly delivered, creates a legal record of notice, meaning if Derek or Emily continued their behavior after receiving it, that continuation became evidence of willful conduct. The preserve evidence notice meant that if they deleted anything, that deletion could be used against them. And the records request meant the leasing company was now formally on notice that the guarantor on their contract was scrutinizing every page. Patricia's last words as I left were measured and deliberate. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "if that signature is forged, they didn't just embarrass you. They committed a crime." I drove east with that sentence sitting in the passenger seat beside me. Derek's house looked different in the Monday noon light, smaller somehow, without the balloons and the crowd and the performance of Saturday afternoon. He opened the door before I knocked, which told me he'd been watching for my car. "Dad," his voice landed somewhere between relief and rehearsal. "Come in." Emily was in the kitchen, visible through the archway, moving with the deliberate busyness of someone who wanted to appear uninvolved while remaining within earshot. I noted it and said nothing. Derek poured 2 glasses of water and set them on the table. He didn't touch his. "I know Saturday was a lot," he started. "It was a choice," I said, "not an accident." He shifted in his seat. "Look, things have been tense. Emily and we've been worried. About you. About the situation." He spread his hands open on the table, the gesture of a man trying to look like he had nothing to hide. "We don't want things to get complicated, Dad. We just need you to understand where we're coming from." "Tell me where that is, Derek." He leaned forward slightly. "We need you. Okay, the business needs stability right now, and your name on those agreements gives us that. That's all this is." I watched him for a moment. 30 years of reading customers, knowing the difference between a man who didn't understand what was wrong with his engine and a man who understood perfectly and was hoping you didn't, had given me a finely calibrated sense for the second type. "What were those papers on your desk?" I asked. Something moved behind his eyes. Fast controlled, but there. "What papers?" "The ones with the bank logo. The ones you moved to the side drawer when I sat down." From the kitchen, Emily's movements had gone still. Derek's jaw tightened. "Those are business documents. Nothing that involves you, Roxo." I said quietly, "Everything in this house that has my name on it involves me." He looked at me, then really looked the way he hadn't done in years, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not remorse, not guilt exactly. Something more like recalculation. And Dad, just don't make this into something it isn't. We're family. That word. I had heard it used as a reason, a shield, a debt collector, and a threat, sometimes all 4 in the same conversation. I stood up. "I'm not making it into anything," I said. "I'm just paying attention. Something I should have done sooner." I picked up my folder from the table. I had not opened it once during the entire meeting. I hadn't needed to. "Tell Emily the legal mail will arrive tomorrow," I said. "She should read it carefully." I walked to the door. Derek followed, and for a moment he stood in the frame behind me, and I could hear the particular silence of a man who had expected a different conversation and hadn't yet decided what to do with the one he'd gotten instead. I didn't look back. I was halfway to my truck when I heard Emily's voice from inside, sharp and low, cutting through the afternoon quiet. "He can't do anything," she said. "We have the paperwork." I kept walking. Because what Emily didn't know, what neither of them had yet understood, was that having paperwork and having clean paperwork were 2 entirely different things. And somewhere in Nashville, a leasing company had just received a formal request to show me exactly which kind they had. He showed up at 6:20 Tuesday evening. I heard the truck before I saw it. That particular engine note I'd listened to 100 times when Derek used to bring it in for service back when we still had the kind of relationship where that was a normal thing. The headlights swept across the garage door as he pulled into the driveway, and I set down the carburetor I'd been cleaning and waited. He came through the side door without knocking. That told me everything about his state of mind. He still thought of this space as somewhere he had automatic entry. He looked around the garage the way people look at a place they associate with a version of themselves they no longer inhabit, then settled his gaze on me. "We need to talk," he said. "You drove 40 minutes on a Tuesday night," I said. "So talk." He pulled a stool from beside the workbench and sat down, uninvited, another tell. Derek always occupied space before he asked permission. It was a habit he'd had since he was 19 years old, and he'd never once examined it. "The legal mail arrived this afternoon," he said. "Patricia Owens. Frank set that up, didn't he?" "Frank introduced us," I said. "I made the decision." Derek's jaw worked for a moment. "Dad, this is you're making this so much bigger than it needs to be. Emily and I made a mistake on Saturday. Things got out of hand. But sending cease and desist letters requesting lease records..." He shook his head. "That's not how family handles things." "Tell me how family handles things, Derek." "So by talking. By sitting down and working it out without lawyers." I picked up a shop rag and wiped down my hands slowly, the way I always did, when I needed a moment to think without showing that I needed a moment to think. The garage was quiet around us tools on their hooks. The faint smell of motor oil, the particular stillness of a space that had absorbed 30 years of honest work. "Shoot, you hired a plane," I said. "You arranged for a banner to fly over a party you invited me to. You handed Emily a microphone and let her stand in front of 90 people and call my wife a gold digger." I set the rag down. "That's not things getting out of hand, son. That's a plan." Derek stood up from the stool. He was taller than me by 2 inches, and had always used it unconsciously, that slight physical advantage, the way certain people lean on height, the way others lean on volume. "You want to know the truth." His voice had shifted, the rehearsed concern was gone, and what replaced it was something rawer and less careful. "Margaret walked into this family, and suddenly everything changed. You stopped returning my calls. You stopped coming to Sunday dinners. You stopped being available when we needed you. And now you're hiding behind lawyers and paperwork, like we're strangers to you. Like 62 years of being your son means nothing anymore." He paused, and I could hear him breathing short, uneven breaths, the kind that come just before a person says something they cannot take back. "We are your family, Dad, not her." "When you needed me," I said, "or when the business needed my signature, so..." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Derek's hands opened and closed at his sides. "That's not fair." "Derek." I kept my voice level. "Who paid for the banner?" He looked away toward the wall of tools, toward the window, anywhere but at me. "It doesn't matter who paid for it. It matters to me. And it'll matter to a judge if it comes to that." He turned back sharply. "Don't threaten me." "I'm not threatening you. I'm asking a question you keep refusing to answer." I held his gaze. "Who paid for the banner?" He said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, with the particular bitterness of a man who had come to negotiate and found the other party wasn't negotiating, "Emily handled it." "Thank you," I said. He stared at me. "That's all you're going to say? That's all I needed to hear?" He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. The overhead light threw his shadow long across the concrete floor. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something that sounded almost like a warning and almost like a plea, the two things so tangled together I couldn't separate them. "If you pull out of those agreements, Dad, if you actually go through with whatever Owens is planning, we're done. The business is done. Everything we've been building for the past 3 years is done." I looked at him steadily. "I hear you, Derek. Do you?" "I hear exactly what you just said." He left without another word. I listened to his truck back out of the driveway and pull away down the street, and then the garage was quiet again, just the hum of the fluorescent light and the distant sound of the neighborhood settling into evening. I stood there for a full minute before I picked up my phone and opened a new note. I typed out Derek's exact words. "If you pull out, we're done," along with the time, the date, and the context. What Derek had said, intentionally or not, was a legal acknowledgement that my name was actively embedded in a financial agreement that his business depended on. That kind of statement made in a private confrontation carried weight. Patricia needed to know about it. By Wednesday morning, the phone calls had started. Not from Derek, from the periphery. An aunt in Clarksville who said she'd heard I was trying to destroy Derek's business and wanted to know if it was true. A cousin who left a voicemail explaining that family didn't take each other to court. A man from our old church who said he was calling as a friend and spent 4 minutes telling me why I was wrong. None of them had seen the banner. None of them had been at the party. All of them had apparently seen Emily's Facebook post. Margaret showed it to me over breakfast. Emily had written 3 paragraphs about the importance of protecting family from outside influences, about the pain of watching a parent be led astray by someone with unclear intentions, about the courage it took to speak difficult truths. She had not mentioned the plane. She had not mentioned the microphone. She had not mentioned anything that had actually happened on Saturday. What she'd written was a performance of virtue carefully constructed to reach people who hadn't been present. I read it twice. Then I said, "Screenshot it, timestamp and all." Margaret already had. "She's trying to get ahead of the story," Margaret said, setting her phone face down on the table. "She's trying to write the story," I corrected. "There's a difference." The calls continued through the morning. I answered none of them. Margaret and I had agreed. Everything went through Patricia, and anything that crossed the line from pressure into threat got documented and forwarded. We worked through the list methodically, the way you work through a diagnostic checklist, not with panic, but with attention. It was just past noon when my phone showed a notification from an email address I didn't recognize. The subject line was blank. The message inside was 4 sentences long. "Mr. Calloway, I saw the live stream from your birthday party. I used to handle the books for your son's company. I have something you need to see." I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone on the table and looked at Margaret. "Someone who worked for Derek," I said, "just reached out." She studied my face. "Do you trust it?" "I don't trust anything I haven't verified," I said. "But I'm going to find out." I typed a careful reply, asking for a name and a suggested meeting place, somewhere public, somewhere neutral, somewhere I could bring Frank if the conversation warranted it. Then I closed the email app and stared at the wall for a moment, thinking about Derek's words the night before. "If you pull out, we're done." He'd said it like a threat. But the more I sat with it, the more it sounded like something else entirely, like a man describing the exact dimensions of a trap he'd already built around himself. The name she gave me was Sandra Pruitt. Frank ran it through his network before I agreed to meet her, a quiet check, the kind that takes a few phone calls and an afternoon. By Thursday morning, he called me back with 3 facts. Sandra had worked as a bookkeeper for Derek's company. For 14 months, she had left abruptly 8 weeks ago under circumstances that Derek had described to mutual acquaintances as a performance issue. And she had a reputation among the small business accounting community in Nashville as someone meticulous to the point of being difficult. Difficult how? I asked. The kind of difficult that comes from refusing to sign off on things that don't add up, Frank said. I called her that afternoon and arranged to meet at a coffee shop on West End Avenue, public, well-lit, the kind of place where nothing dramatic could happen without 12 witnesses. I asked Frank to come. Not because I needed protection, but because Frank had spent 40 years reading financial documents, and I wanted a second set of eyes on whatever Sandra brought with her. She was already there when we arrived. Mid-50s, a gray cardigan, a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She had the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided, after much deliberation, to set it down. A manila folder sat on the table in front of her edges, worn, held shut with a single rubber band. She stood when she saw us, shook my hand with both of hers, and said quietly, "Thank you for coming, Mr. Calloway. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I told her honestly. "But here we are." Frank pulled out the chair across from her, sat down and folded his hands on the table the way he always does when he means business. Sandra looked at him, then back at me, and reached for the folder. "I want to be honest with you about why I'm here," she said, without preamble. "I left Derek's company because I was asked to do things I wasn't willing to do. When I pushed back, I was let go. I've been thinking about whether to say something for 2 months." She paused. Seeing that live stream made the decision for me. She opened the envelope and placed 3 documents on the table. The first was a printed email chain dated 9 months ago, an exchange between Derek and a man named Garrett, who appeared to be a business contact involved in arranging the lease extension. In the middle of the chain, Derek had written a sentence that Frank read aloud quietly, more to himself than to us. "Dad will sign. Just prepare the addendum and I'll handle the rest." The second document was an internal expense record showing a payment to a document processing service, the kind of service used for digitizing and formatting paperwork. The payment had been made 4 days before the lease addendum was filed. The third was a handwritten note Sandra had made for herself, at the time a record of a conversation she'd had with Derek, in which he had instructed her to process a reimbursement related to signature preparation and not to itemize it on the standard expense report. I sat with those 3 documents for a long moment. "Sandra," I said carefully, "what you're describing, using a scanned version of someone's signature on a new legal document without their knowledge or consent, that's not just a contract violation. In the United States, that constitutes forgery. It's a criminal offense." She nodded. "I know what it is. That's why I didn't want to process the reimbursement the way he asked. And that's why I'm here." Frank was already making notes. He looked up briefly. "Are these originals or copies?" "Copies," Sandra said. "The originals are stored securely. I also have the email chain in its digital form with full metadata intact." I looked at Frank. He gave me the small level nod that meant what I thought it meant. We left the coffee shop an hour later, with copies of everything Sandra had brought along with her contact information and her agreement to make the originals available to Patricia Owens. On the drive back, Frank said almost nothing until we were parked in my driveway. "Tere," he said, "you have what you need. Now it's about process." That afternoon, I made the call to the leasing company Pinnacle Fleet Solutions, the company that had issued the original commercial vehicle lease. I put it on speaker. Margaret sat across from me with a notepad. Frank stood by the window. The representative who answered was a man named Todd, who had the careful, slightly guarded manner of someone trained to give information without giving away too much. I identified myself as the guarantor on the account and told him I had questions about the records associated with the agreement. He pulled up the file. I asked my 3 questions slowly and in order. "First, can you confirm who is listed as the authorized signer on the lease extension filed 9 months ago?" A pause. "The extension lists you as the authorizing guarantor, Mr. Calloway." "Second, can you confirm that the insurance policy on the leased vehicle has been continuously maintained and current with all authorized drivers properly listed?" A longer pause. The sound of keyboard clicks. "I'm showing a lapse in the supplemental coverage for a period of approximately 6 weeks, ending about 4 months ago. The primary policy remained active, but the supplemental rider covering additional operators was not renewed on time." I wrote that down. Margaret underlined it twice. "Third question," I said. If it were determined that the signature on a lease extension had been obtained without the guarantor's knowledge or consent, hypothetically speaking, what would your company's process be? The pause this time was the longest. Mr. Calloway. Todd said, "We have procedures for that. Documented procedures. It would trigger an internal review of the entire agreement." "Thank you, Todd," I said. "I appreciate your time." I ended the call. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Frank set his pen down on the table with a soft, deliberate click. "The insurance lapse is a breach of the lease terms," he said. "That alone gives them grounds to act independent of the signature question. You don't have to prove the fraud to put the machine in motion. The machine has its own reasons now." I was still writing notes when my phone buzzed on the table. A text from Derek. 5 words, no punctuation, sent at exactly the moment the call had ended, as if he somehow knew. "I'll make everyone believe you're mentally unwell." I read it twice, set the phone down, looked at Frank, then at Margaret. "Log it," I said. "Time, date, exact wording." Margaret was already writing. And somewhere behind that threat, I could hear something I recognized from 30 years in the repair business, the sound of a man who had just realized the damage was worse than he'd told anyone, and was now looking for someone else to blame for it. I called Patricia at 6:30 that evening. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting to hear from me before the weekend. I read her Derek's text message word for word. "I'll make everyone believe you're mentally unwell," and the line went quiet for a moment, in the particular way that lawyers go quiet when something confirms what they already suspected. "Screenshot it and send it to me tonight," she said. "Time-stamped, unedited, directly from your Messages app. Already done." "Good." A pause. "Raymond, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without panicking. This message suggests they may be considering a conservatorship filing." I had heard the word before in a general sense, the legal process, by which a court appoints someone to manage the affairs of a person deemed unable to do so themselves. What I had not considered until that moment was that it could be used as a weapon. Patricia explained it plainly. In Tennessee, as in most states, a conservatorship petition requires documented evidence that the subject lacks the mental or physical capacity to manage their own affairs. A judge would not simply take someone's word for it. Medical evaluations, witness testimony, and a formal hearing would all be required. It was not a process that could be weaponized easily or quickly. Shakiti. But, Patricia said, the threat itself is significant. If they file even without merit, it creates a public record and a period of uncertainty that can be used to pressure you into compliance. It's a delay tactic dressed up as concern. And so how do we stop it before it starts? We build a counterfile. We don't wait for them to file, we prepare a response package now. Your medical records from the past 2 years. A letter from your physician. Witness statements from people who have interacted with you regularly. Frank Margaret neighbors, former clients. And the video evidence from the party which shows clearly that you were calm, coherent, and responding to provocation rather than initiating it. She paused again. We also document every threatening communication they send. Each one becomes evidence that this is a control strategy, not a welfare concern. I thought about Derek's face at the party, the raised phone, the practiced look of concern he'd worn at the lunch table, the way Emily had said he's after the assets into a live microphone. They've been building this for a while, I said. Probably, Patricia said, which means we need to be further ahead of them than they expect. By Friday night, Margaret and I had drafted a list of 12 people willing to provide written statements about my character, cognitive sharpness, and day-to-day functioning. Frank was first. Donna Hartwell was on the list. Curtis Webb. 3 former clients from the garage who had worked with me within the past year. 2 neighbors. A deacon from our church who had known me for 11 years. Saturday morning, I made one phone call. I called Derek. Not to argue, not to threaten. I had one sentence prepared and I delivered it in the same tone I used when I told a customer their vehicle was ready, calm, factual, final. To Derek, I said, I want you to know that I've spoken with my doctor and I've asked Frank and several friends to provide written statements about my health and judgment. I thought you should know in case it's relevant to anything you're planning. 3 seconds of silence. What's that supposed to mean? He said. It means exactly what I said. Have a good weekend. I ended the call and set the phone on the workbench. Frank had coached me on this the night before. The goal was not to provoke, it was to signal clearly and without hostility that Raymond Calloway had anticipated the move and had already begun to answer it. Sometimes the most effective thing you can say is a sentence that closes a door the other person thought was still open. Derek's response came 40 minutes later, not as a call, but as a text. You think this is a game, we have lawyers too. You'll regret making us your enemies. Emily's response came 11 minutes after that from her own number. We have documentation that proves you've been erratic and difficult for years. Try us. I photographed both messages with a separate device to preserve the metadata, then forwarded the originals to Patricia with a single line "2 more" for the file. Patricia's reply came back within minutes. This is exactly what we needed. They've just demonstrated the harassment pattern in writing. Keep your phone charged. Margaret read the exchange over my shoulder and said nothing for a moment. Then, they think threatening you is the same as winning. A lot of people make that mistake, I said. By late Saturday afternoon, the counterfile was more than 30 pages thick. Medical summary, physician's letter, 12 witness statements, the full video evidence package, the time-stamped text messages, Emily's Facebook post, the anonymous envelope from the porch, and a written timeline of every significant event since the birthday party. I was organizing the last section when an email arrived from Pinnacle Fleet Solutions. The subject line was brief and bureaucratic in the way that important things often are. Reaccount verification request, guarantor signature confirmation. The body of the email was 4 sentences. They had completed a preliminary review of the records request I had submitted through Patricia's office. They had identified discrepancies in the documentation associated with the lease extension. They were requesting that I come in person to verify my signature against their records. And they were asking me to bring photo identification and any original documents I believed to be relevant. I read the email 3 times. Then I printed it, placed it in the counterfile, and closed the folder with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent his whole career knowing that the truth, given enough time and the right paperwork, has a way of making itself impossible to ignore. Patricia met me in the lobby of Pinnacle Fleet Solutions at 9:55 Monday morning. The office was on the 2nd floor of a commercial building off Murfreesboro Pike, the kind of place designed to feel neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile, with gray carpet and framed certificates on the walls, and a receptionist who offered water with the practiced warmth of someone who had been trained to make difficult conversations feel routine. Patricia had been here before, she told me quietly as we signed in on an unrelated matter 2 years ago. She knew the layout. She knew the tone. We were shown to a conference room where a man named Robert Vance was already seated. Vance was the regional account manager for commercial leasing, mid-50s heavyset, with the particular brand of careful professionalism that comes from spending a career managing other people's financial problems. He shook my hand, shook Patricia's, and gestured to the chairs across from him without unnecessary ceremony. "Mr. Calloway," he said, opening a folder on the table. "Thank you for coming in. As I mentioned in my email, we've conducted a preliminary review of the records associated with your guarantor account, and we've identified some items we need your help clarifying." "Of course," I said. He placed 3 documents on the table. The original lease agreement, the addendum filed 9 months ago, and a signature verification form he asked me to complete on the spot. I signed it in full view of both Vance and Patricia, using my normal signature with its natural variations and imperfections. Vance placed my fresh signature beside the addendum signature and studied both without speaking for a moment. "Mr. Calloway," he said carefully, "I want to be transparent with you. There are characteristics in the addendum signature that are inconsistent with your signature on the original agreement and with what you've just provided. Our compliance team flagged this during the preliminary review." "What kind of inconsistencies?" Patricia asked. "Pressure distribution, ink flow, the angle of certain letter forms." He closed the folder. "I'm not a forensic examiner, and I won't characterize what I'm seeing beyond saying that it warrants further analysis. What I can tell you is that this triggers our internal audit protocol, a formal review of every document in the account file, including payment records, insurance filings, and all communications associated with the account." I nodded slowly. "And what does that process look like?" "It means we bring in our compliance team. We may engage an outside forensic document examiner. We notify our legal department." He paused. "And depending on what the audit finds, we notify the relevant lender and insurer, because they have interests in this account as well." Patricia leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Vance, just so we're clear, this audit proceeds regardless of what Mr. Calloway does or doesn't do from this point forward." "Correct," Vance said. "Once the protocol is triggered, it runs independently. That's by design. It protects the company, and frankly, it protects the guarantor as well." He then asked me one final question, in the measured tone of a man who already suspected the answer. "Mr. Calloway, do you have any reason to believe that someone with access to your personal documents may have submitted this addendum without your authorization?" I looked at him steadily. "Yes," I said, "I do." He wrote something in the margin of his notepad, capped his pen, and stood to shake my hand again. "We'll be in touch through your attorney's office." The drive home took 20 minutes. Patricia and I didn't speak much. She was already on her phone, making notes, sending emails. When she dropped me at my car, she said two things. "They'll find what Sandra gave us and more. Their audit will go deeper than we could go on our own." She paused at the wheel. "And Raymond, whoever had access to your email account, your documents, your digital life, you need to close every door today, not tomorrow, today." I spent the next 2 hours doing exactly that. I changed every password, email, bank accounts, the cloud storage where I kept scanned documents, the account I used for the garage's old business records. I enabled two-factor authentication on everything that offered it, which meant any future login attempt would require a code sent to my phone, a phone only I controlled. I called my bank directly and placed a verbal flag on the account requesting that any changes to authorized users or contact information require in-person verification with photo identification. Then I pulled my credit report. In the United States, every consumer has the right to access their credit report from each of the 3 major bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, and to review every inquiry account and reported activity. I had not checked mine in over a year. It was a gap I was not proud of. I found it on the 3rd page of the Experian report. A hard inquiry, the kind generated when someone applies for new credit in your name, dated 11 weeks ago. The name of the requesting institution was a commercial lending company I had never heard of and had certainly never contacted. 11 weeks ago. Around the same time the lease addendum had been filed. I set the report on the workbench and stared at it for a long moment. A hard inquiry meant that someone using my personal information had applied for credit in my name without my knowledge or consent. In the United States, that was identity fraud, a federal offense separate from and in addition to the forgery question. I photographed the page and texted it to Patricia with 3 words, "Found another one." Her reply came back in under a minute. "Call me when you're ready." This just got significantly more serious. I was still holding the phone when Margaret appeared in the garage doorway. She had a look on her face that I had learned in 11 months of marriage meant she had found something she hadn't been looking for. "Raymond," she said quietly, "you need to come see this." Margaret was standing at the kitchen table with her laptop open when I walked in from the garage. She didn't say anything at first. She just turned the screen toward me. It was a video shot on a phone, slightly shaky, in the way that candid recordings always are from an angle I didn't immediately recognize. Then I placed it the far left corner of Derek's backyard, near the gate where the older guests had clustered during the party. Someone had been standing there with their phone held low, almost hip level, which was why the footage had a different quality than the clips Donna and Curtis had provided. It caught the scene from below and to the side the way a security camera might, without the self-consciousness of someone who knew they were recording. "Who sent this?" I asked. "Helen Marsh," Margaret said. "She's in my Tuesday Bible study. She called me this afternoon." Margaret paused. "She said Emily came to the Wednesday evening service and told 3 women that you had been behaving erratically for months, that you'd been making poor financial decisions, that she and Derek were worried about your mental state." Margaret's voice stayed even, but I could hear the effort it cost her. "Helen said she didn't believe a word of it. She went home and found the video on her phone from Saturday and called me within the hour." I pulled out a chair and sat down. Helen Marsh, a woman I knew by face and by name, a quiet, observant presence in the congregation, who had been attending the same church for 30 years, had been standing near the gate at the birthday party with her phone in her hand. Not recording intentionally, she had told Margaret. She'd been trying to show a photo to a friend when the banner appeared, and her phone had automatically captured the next several minutes of video without her realizing it. Sometimes the most important footage is the kind nobody planned to take. I called Patricia and put her on speaker while Margaret set up the laptop on the kitchen counter so we could watch the clip together. The first 90 seconds showed the banner passing overhead, not from below, looking up as in Donna's footage, but from the side, which meant you could see the faces of the people watching it. Derek's face was visible in the upper left of the frame. He was not looking up at the banner. He was looking at his phone screen, and he was smiling. "Pause it," Patricia said. Margaret paused the clip. "Not that footage shows your son watching a live stream or recording rather than reacting to the banner as a surprise," Patricia said. "That's behavioral evidence of prior knowledge and planning. Keep going." The next section of the clip covered Emily's approach to the microphone. From this angle, the audio was cleaner than Curtis's recording. Helen had been closer than we'd realized. Emily's voice came through sharp and clear, including the moment she turned slightly and said to the woman beside her, loud enough for the microphone to pick up, "She's after the assets." We had already known about that sentence from Curtis's clip. But Helen's footage added something Curtis's hadn't captured. 4 minutes and 17 seconds into the recording. In the brief window between Derek's whispered exchange with a guest and Emily's walk to the microphone, Emily glanced down at her watch. It was a small gesture. Quick, habitual, the kind of thing a person does without thinking, but the timing was exact. She checked the time 53 seconds before the banner made its final pass over the yard. "She knew when the plane was coming back," I said. "She timed her walk to the microphone," Patricia said. "She wanted to be standing there holding it when the banner made its last pass. For the camera, for the live stream." A pause. "Raymond, this is premeditation. This is not a family dispute that got out of hand. This is a coordinated event." The words settled over the kitchen like a change in air pressure. Margaret closed the laptop gently. She walked to the counter, filled a glass of water, and stood with her back to me for a moment. When she turned around, her eyes were clear. Helen also said," Margaret continued, "that she told Emily directly at the Wednesday service that she didn't believe the things Emily was saying about you. And Emily told her that anyone who defended you was only seeing what you wanted them to see." Margaret set down the glass. Helen said that was the moment she decided to call me. I thought about Helen Marsh, a woman in her late 60s, who had spent 30 years in the same congregation, who had watched my family from a careful, quiet distance, who had held her phone at hip level on a Saturday afternoon without knowing she was collecting evidence that would matter weeks later. I need to call her, I said, to thank her. She asked me to tell you, Margaret said, that she's available to provide a written statement. She already spoke with her own pastor about it. I forwarded Helen's clip to Patricia, along with a note about the timestamp observation, the watch check, the 53 seconds, the deliberate walk to the microphone. Patricia's response was immediate. This addresses the guardianship threat directly. Between the credit report inquiry, the signature discrepancy, the audio evidence, and now this, they cannot credibly claim you are the unstable party in this situation. I'll have a formal response package ready by Thursday. I set the phone down and looked at the closed laptop on the counter. 4 video files, each one captured by someone who had simply been present and paying attention. 4 ordinary people with phones who had, without coordination or instruction, documented a performance that its architects had assumed would be remembered only as they intended it. I replayed the clip one more time in my mind. Emily's glance at her watch. The 53 seconds. The deliberate walk. There was something else in that footage, though. Something I had noticed in the final few seconds before Helen's phone had stopped recording. A detail so small I'd almost passed over it. A detail that, if I was reading it correctly, pointed to something I hadn't yet fully accounted for. I didn't mention it to Margaret that night. I needed to look at it again in the morning more carefully before I said anything to anyone. Before I reveal what the investigation confirmed, and trust me, what came back in that report was something I was not fully prepared to see in writing. I want you to do one thing. Comment the word "open" below. Just that one word. It tells me you are here, and it tells me this story is reaching the right person. What I am about to share is the moment everything stopped being a suspicion and became a fact. A small note. The following portion of this story contains certain recreated and fictionalized elements, included purely for educational and storytelling purposes. If you feel this content is not the right fit for you, this is a perfectly good place to stop and choose something that serves you better. That decision is entirely yours. I was in the garage at 5:45 Tuesday morning with Helen's clip open on my laptop and a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. The detail I had noticed the night before was in the final 11 seconds of the recording. At the point where Helen's phone had been angling slightly downward, she had been lowering it, probably assuming the main event was over. The frame had caught a brief, unguarded exchange near the side gate of Derek's backyard. Derek, and a man standing close beside him. The man was turned partially away from the camera, but his profile was visible for 3 clear seconds before Helen's recording ended. Medium build, light jacket, despite the July heat. The particular posture of someone who belonged somewhere without wanting to be noticed belonging there. I had seen that profile in a document. I pulled up the email chain Sandra had provided the exchange between Derek and his business contact, arranging the lease extension. The name at the top of the chain was Garrett Holloway. I had no photograph of Garrett Holloway, but I had a 3-second profile in a video taken at my birthday party, and I had the instinct of a man who had spent 30 years reading people across a repair counter. I called Patricia at 7:15. "The man standing with Derek when the banner flew over," I said. "I think it's Garrett Holloway, the contact from the lease extension email chain." A pause. "If that's confirmed, it places a material witness to the fraud at the scene of the public humiliation. That's not coincidence, Raymond. That's coordination across multiple fronts." Another pause. "Send me a screenshot of the frame. I'll have someone who knows Holloway's face take a look." I sent it within the minute. By 8 o'clock, Margaret had made breakfast. Neither of us was particularly hungry and we were sitting across the kitchen table from each other with the quiet that had become familiar between us. Not empty silence, but the kind that holds weight without requiring words to fill it. "Whatever Pinnacle finds," she said finally, "it goes further than Derek and Emily, doesn't it?" It wasn't a question. Probably," I said. Garrett Holloway arranged the paperwork. Derek signed off on the plan. Someone paid for the banner, organized the live stream, scripted Emily's speech. I turned my coffee cup in my hands. This wasn't put together by two people acting on impulse. She nodded slowly. "And if the investigation goes where it might go, what happens to the people who work for Derek? The ones who just showed up to do their jobs?" I had been sitting with that question since Frank had first raised the insurance lapse issue 2 weeks ago. I didn't have a clean answer then. I still didn't have one now. Frank arrived at 9, as I had asked him to. He sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and listened without interrupting while I walked him through everything: Helen's clip, Garrett Holloway's profile, the credit inquiry, the insurance lapse, the audit Pinnacle had triggered. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Ray," he said, "I need to ask you something directly. If Pinnacle's investigation confirms fraud, full confirmation, not just discrepancy, and they refer the matter to the lender and insurer, Derek's company loses its financing structure. The lease gets pulled. Depending on the lender's response, the credit line could be called in." He set his pen down. "That's not a fine. That's a collapse. I know, and there are people working for that company who had nothing to do with any of this." "I know that too." He looked at me steadily. "So what are you going to do?" I had thought about this the way I thought about a complicated repair, not rushing to a conclusion, but working through each component until the answer became the only one that made mechanical sense. "I'm going to submit what I have," I said. "Everything Sandra gave us, everything Pinnacle already has. I'm not going to add to it or exaggerate it or push beyond what the evidence actually shows." I paused. "But I'm also going to call Patricia today and ask whether there's a mechanism formally, legally, to separate the fraud investigation from the employment question. To make sure that whatever happens to Derek's business doesn't automatically pull the floor out from under people who never had a vote in any of this." Frank picked his pen back up. "That's the right answer," he said. "It's also the harder one. Most right answers are." The call from Pinnacle came at 9:47. It was Robert Vance, and his voice had a different quality than it had in the conference room. More careful, more formal, the voice of a man reading from a script that the legal department had approved. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I want to inform you that our compliance team has completed its preliminary findings. We have identified indicators of misrepresentation in the documentation associated with your guarantor account. Specifically, the signature on the lease extension addendum does not meet our verification standards, and the insurance lapse we identified represents a material breach of the lease terms." I had my notepad open. I wrote down every word. "Based on these findings," Vance continued, "we are initiating a formal investigation under our fraud and misrepresentation protocol. As required by our agreement with the lender and insurer on this account, we will be notifying both parties of our findings and the initiation of this process. They will conduct their own reviews independently." "I understand," I said. "We will also be in contact with our legal department regarding next steps. Mr. Calloway, do you authorize us to proceed with the formal investigation?" I looked at Margaret across the table. She gave me the small, steady nod that meant she had already made peace with whatever came next, and was waiting for me to catch up. "Yes," I said. "You have my authorization." Vance thanked me and ended the call. The kitchen was very quiet. Frank set his pen down again. "The lender and insurer will run their own reviews," he said. That process moves on its own timeline now. You didn't start it. You just stopped standing in front of it. I nodded. I was thinking about something Patricia had said early on, that I didn't have to be the hammer. I just had to put the right information in front of the right people. 3 weeks ago, a plane had circled over a birthday party in Nashville with my humiliation written across the sky. The people who had arranged it had believed I think that shame was a tool that only worked in one direction. What Pinnacle didn't tell me, what I wouldn't learn until the following morning, was that the lender had already been watching Derek's account for reasons that had nothing to do with me. Patricia called at 7:10 Wednesday morning while I was still in the garage. "I heard back from the lender last night," she said, without preamble. Meridian Commercial Credit, the institution that backed Derek's business loan. They reached out to my office after Pinnacle notified them. A pause. "Raymond, they've been conducting their own internal review of Derek's account for the past 6 weeks. Before you ever filed your records request. Before Pinnacle triggered its audit." I set down the wrench I'd been holding. "For what reason?" "Covenant violations," Patricia said. "When a business takes out a commercial loan, the agreement typically includes covenants, conditions the borrower must maintain throughout the life of the loan. Things like minimum revenue thresholds, timely financial reporting, maintaining adequate insurance coverage. Derek's company had missed 2 quarterly reporting deadlines and failed to maintain the required minimum cash reserve." She paused again. "Meridian flagged it internally 6 weeks ago. They hadn't acted yet because they were still gathering documentation. Pinnacle's notification accelerated their timeline." I stood very still in the middle of my garage, processing what she was telling me. The lender had been building a case of their own, a separate case rooted in Derek's own financial mismanagement, before I had filed a single document. Whatever was coming had not been caused by me. It had been set in motion by choices Derek had made long before his father became a problem he needed to manage. "Patricia," I said, "does Derek know Meridian has been watching him? Based on the missed reporting deadlines, he probably suspects something. Whether he knows the extent of it..." She let the sentence finish itself. I thanked her and ended the call. I stood in the garage for a few minutes after that, thinking about a principle I had applied 1,000 times in 30 years of repair work. The engine that fails dramatically almost always gave quiet warning signs for months before the breakdown. The customers who brought in cars with catastrophic failures were rarely people who had ignored one warning. They were people who had ignored 6. Derek's business had been failing quietly for a long time. The banner and the birthday party had been, among other things, a distraction, a way to create noise while the machinery underneath was already coming apart. I was in the parking lot of the Kroger on Old Hickory Boulevard Wednesday afternoon when I heard his voice. "Dad." I turned. Derek was walking toward me from 2 rows over, hands in his pockets, moving with the deliberate casualness of a man who had planned this encounter and was trying to make it look accidental. He knew my Wednesday grocery routine. He had known it since he was a teenager. "On Derek," I said. He stopped a few feet away. The parking lot was busy enough that we were surrounded by ordinary Wednesday afternoon life carts, rolling engines, starting a woman arguing gently with a child over cereal. Nobody was paying attention to us. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Not through lawyers, just us." "Talk," I said. He looked older than he had at the birthday party. The confidence that had been so carefully constructed 3 weeks ago had worn through in places, showing something raw underneath. His eyes moved to my face, and then away the way they always did when he was working up to something he didn't want to say. "Pinnacle called us," he said. "And Meridian." He said both names like they were physical objects he was setting down between us. "Dad, this is, you have to understand what you've started. If they pull the financing, the company doesn't survive. We have 14 people on payroll, vendors we owe money to, clients who are counting on us. His voice had shifted into something that sounded almost genuine, the way bad performances sometimes accidentally hit a true note. I know Saturday was wrong. I know it. But this, like I said quietly. Who paid for the banner? His jaw tightened. The almost genuine quality vanished. That's not the point. It's the only point I have left. Every other question has already been answered. I held his gaze. Who paid for it? He looked away toward the middle distance of the parking lot. A long silence. Emily handled the logistics, he said finally. But it was both of us. It was both of us, okay? He turned back. We thought Emily thought that if we did something public, something that made you stop and see what was happening with Margaret, I don't know. Come back. Listen. Come back, I repeated. To the family, to us. We needed you to... He stopped. Something crossed his face that I hadn't seen there in a long time. Not calculation. Something closer to grief, poorly managed. Emily said it would fix you, he said quietly. That's what she said. That if we embarrassed you enough in front of people you cared about, you'd come back to where you belonged. I looked at my son for a long moment. Fix me. As though I were a machine that had drifted out of alignment and needed to be shocked back into the correct position. As though 62 years of living and working and raising him had produced something that could be corrected with a banner and a microphone. Derek, I said, I need you to go home. Dad. Go home. If you want to talk, tell your attorney to call Patricia Owens. That's the only conversation I'm able to have right now. He stood there for another few seconds. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come, hands back in his pockets, shoulders carrying the particular weight of a man who had come to negotiate, and found that the terms he was offering were not being accepted. I finished my grocery shopping. I drove home. I called Patricia from the driveway and told her what Derek had said, every word in order, including Emily said it would fix you. That's an admission, she said immediately. He just confirmed the banner was intentional and purposeful. Get a written account of that conversation to me today, time, location, exact phrasing. The following afternoon, Patricia filed the 30-day demand letter through certified mail and electronic delivery. The letter required Derek and his associated business entities to provide full documentation of every agreement, financial instrument, and communication bearing my name within 30 days. It also formally demanded cessation of any unauthorized use of my personal information, credit profile, or signature. A 30-day demand letter under Tennessee civil law creates a binding legal record of notice, meaning that any failure to comply within the deadline is not an oversight, but a documented choice with consequences attached. That evening, Emily posted on Facebook, "Some people would rather destroy a family business than forgive. Prayers for those who choose bitterness over love." I read it once. Then I forwarded the screenshot to Patricia with a note for the file. She replied within minutes, "The countdown has started. Let's see what 30 days looks like." I had started keeping a calendar on the workbench. Not a digital one. A paper calendar, the kind with large squares for each day, tacked to the pegboard between the socket wrench set and the oil-stained copy of a Chilton manual I'd had since 1987. Every morning, I marked the day with a single line. It was a habit I had developed during a long contract dispute with a parts supplier 12 years ago, when my attorney had told me that in legal matters, time was not abstract. It was evidence. Every day that passed without action from the other party was a day that worked in my favor. Day 18 of the 30-day deadline arrived on a Thursday morning that felt no different from any other, except that my phone showed 2 new notifications before I had finished my first cup of coffee. The first was an automated alert from Meridian Commercial Credit, forwarded through Patricia's office, as all financial communications related to Derek's account now were. It confirmed that a scheduled quarterly payment on Derek's business loan had not been received by the due date. Under the terms of the loan agreement, this constituted a payment default. Meridian had issued a formal notice to Derek's company and had begun the internal review process that would determine next steps. I read the notification twice and set the phone face down on the workbench. Payment default. In plain terms, Derek's company had missed a loan payment it was obligated to make. This was separate from the fraud investigation, separate from the lease dispute. It was a failure of basic financial obligation that existed entirely independent of anything I had done or not done. The machinery was grinding on its own now. The second notification was from Pinnacle. Their records showed that the supplemental insurance rider on the leased vehicle, the same rider whose lapse I had identified weeks earlier, had come up for renewal and had not been renewed. A second lapse on top of the first. 2 violations of the same lease clause documented independently. I forwarded both notifications to Patricia with a short note. She called back within 20 minutes. "They're out of runway," she said. "Between the Meridian default and the second insurance lapse, they needed your signature on something to buy time. That's why Derek came to the parking lot. That's why he said what he said." "How much time do they have?" "Not at this rate." A pause. "Less than they think." I spent the rest of Thursday morning the way I had spent most mornings for the past 3 weeks, methodically, without rushing, working through the list of things that needed doing. I called Frank. I reviewed the demand letter timeline with Patricia. I sat with Margaret over lunch and told her where things stood plainly and without dramatizing it, because she had earned the right to know exactly what was happening in her own life. She listened, finished her sandwich, and said, "What do you need from me today?" That was the thing about Margaret that I had come to rely on without fully realizing it. She never asked what was going to happen. She always asked what needed doing next. "Nothing today," I said. "Just stay close." Emily arrived on Friday afternoon, day 20, without calling ahead. I saw her car from the kitchen window, a silver sedan, pulling slowly into the driveway, as though she was uncertain about the approach. Margaret was in the living room and saw my expression change. "Who is it?" she asked. "Emily." Margaret stood up. "Do you want me here?" "Yes," I said. "I want you exactly here." We went to the front door together. Emily was already on the porch by the time I opened it, dressed more quietly than I had seen her in years. No sharp blazer, no statement jewelry, just a plain blouse, and the particular expression of a woman who had decided that softness was her best available strategy. "Raymond," she said. Her voice was warm in the careful way that rehearsed warmth always is close to the real thing, but slightly too consistent. I was hoping we could talk, just informally, without the legal back and forth. I held the door but didn't move aside. "What do you want to talk about, Emily?" "I want to talk about fixing this." She glanced at Margaret briefly, then back to me. "I know things got out of hand. I know the party was—" She paused, choosing her word. "Excessive. And I'm sorry for that. I am. But Raymond, if Pinnacle and Meridian both move forward, Derek's business doesn't survive. We lose everything. The house." Her voice caught on something that might have been genuine. "We have a child. We have a life we've built." I looked at her for a long moment. There was something almost convincing about it. Almost. The catch in the voice, the quieter clothes, the careful use of my first name, instead of the pointed formality of recent weeks. It was a good performance, and I had no doubt she had rehearsed it. But underneath the softness was the same Emily who had checked her watch 53 seconds before the banner appeared. Who had said she's after the assets into a live microphone. Who had texted, "We have documentation that proves you've been erratic," from her own phone with her own name attached. When Emily. I said, "I hear what you're saying, and I understand the situation you're describing." I kept my voice even, But everything related to these matters goes through my attorney. That's not me being difficult. That's the only way this conversation can happen right now. Something shifted behind her eyes. The softness thinned at the edges. Chaktika. We already have a paper you signed, she said. Her voice had dropped slightly, not a threat exactly, but the ghost of one. Derek just needs one more signature to get through this quarter. One signature, Raymond. That's all. The words landed in the air between us with more weight than she had intended. Margaret, standing just behind my left shoulder, said nothing, but I felt her go very still. Emily, I said quietly, I need you to leave now. She left. I closed the door. Margaret and I stood in the hallway for a moment without speaking. Then I picked up my phone and called Patricia. She just told me they have a document with my signature, I said, and that they need one more. Patricia's response was immediate and sharp. Which document did she specify? No. It doesn't matter which one. What matters is that she just confirmed directly to you with your wife as a witness that they are currently in possession of a document bearing your name and that they want additional authorization from you. That is an inadvertent admission of unauthorized use. A brief pause. Raymond, your wife, heard this, she was standing 2 feet away. So good. I need written statements from both of you tonight. Time, location, exact words. Another pause, and then a sound I had not heard from Patricia before, something close to quiet satisfaction. They just handed us exactly what we needed. I set the phone down, checked my email. A new message from Pinnacle Fleet Solutions, sent 12 minutes ago, subject line stark and unambiguous. Payment default confirmed, account review escalated. The countdown was no longer abstract. It was a number, and the number was 10. The extension request arrived on day 27 through proper channels, attorney to attorney, formatted correctly using the right language. That was the first sign that Derek had finally hired someone competent. Patricia forwarded it to me Wednesday morning with a single line of her own appended at the bottom. Read carefully. The ask is reasonable. The conditions are not. I read it at the kitchen table while Margaret poured coffee. The letter, written by a Nashville attorney named Warren Dodd, requested a 15-day extension of the demand letter deadline on the grounds that Derek's company needed additional time to compile the requested financial documentation. It cited business complexity, the volume of records involved, and the ongoing Pinnacle review as factors outside Derek's immediate control. On the surface, it sounded like a measured professional response. But Patricia's instinct was right. The conditions were not. Warren Dodd's letter contained no acknowledgement of the signature discrepancy, no reference to the insurance lapses, no mention of the unauthorized credit inquiry, no offer to provide the financial disclosure Patricia had specifically requested, a full accounting of every document, agreement, and financial instrument bearing my name. The extension request asked for more time without offering anything in return except the promise of future cooperation, which was not a condition but a suggestion. I called Patricia at 8:30. They want the runway, I said, without the landing requirements. Exactly, she said. I'll respond today. I'll offer the extension on 2 conditions: full financial disclosure within the extended period, and written confirmation that no further documents bearing your name will be submitted or utilized without your explicit written consent going forward. A pause. My expectation is that they'll reject both conditions, and if they do, then we have a documented record showing that they were offered a reasonable path and chose not to take it. That matters. By Thursday afternoon, Warren Dodd's reply had arrived. It declined both conditions. The disclosure requirement was described as overly broad and burdensome. The consent provision was characterized as an unreasonable restriction on normal business operations. Normal business operations. I read that phrase 3 times. Patricia called within minutes of forwarding it to me. They just told a court on paper that using your name without your explicit consent is normal, she said. Warren Dodd is competent, but his client isn't giving him anything to work with. The meeting on day 28 was Derek's idea. He asked Warren Dodd to request it, which told me he had reached the stage of desperation where he believed he could accomplish in person what the paperwork had failed to accomplish on paper. Patricia agreed to the meeting on the condition that it take place at her office, that Frank be present as a neutral witness, and that nothing discussed would constitute a waiver of any existing legal position. Derek arrived at 6 o'clock Thursday evening without Emily, which surprised me. He sat across the conference table from me with Warren Dodd beside him, a trim, careful man in his 50s, who spent the first 5 minutes establishing ground rules with the quiet efficiency of someone trying to prevent a fire he could already smell. Frank sat to my left. Patricia sat at the head of the table. Derek looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "Dad," he said, "I need you to understand what happens if this goes all the way. People lose jobs. Vendors don't get paid. We have clients who are counting on us for projects that are already underway." His voice had the quality I had heard in the parking lot, almost genuine, stretched thin over something harder underneath. "I'm not asking you to forgive everything. I'm just asking you to give us room to fix it." "Shakti Saiji, Derek," I said. The banner flew over a party of 90 people. Your wife stood at a microphone and made false statements about my wife in front of those same 90 people. Someone used my signature on a legal document I never authorized. Someone made a credit inquiry in my name without my knowledge. I folded my hands on the table. Which part of that is a misunderstanding that needs room to fix? He shifted in his seat. Warren Dodd put a hand lightly on his forearm, a lawyer's signal to slow down. But Derek wasn't reading signals anymore. "It was a mistake," Derek said. "The banner was it was meant to get your attention. It was supposed to be a wake-up call, not a," he stopped, restarted. "It was a joke that went too far." I looked at him steadily. "Does a joke come with an invoice?" Silence. Frank to my left wrote something on his legal pad without looking up. "The banner company billed someone," I continued. "The pilot filed a flight plan. There was a transaction, a schedule, a coordination between at least 3 parties. That's not a joke. That's a production." I kept my voice level without heat. "And the lease addendum, and the credit inquiry. Were those jokes too?" Derek's jaw tightened. Warren Dodd leaned toward him and said something quiet that I couldn't hear. Derek shook his head slightly. Then he looked at me across the table, and the last of the performance fell away entirely. "I'll tell everyone you're senile," he said. Low flat, the voice of a man who had run out of other options and was reaching for the one he'd been holding in reserve. "I'll make sure every person in this city who matters knows that you're not capable of making sound decisions. That Margaret manipulated a confused old man into cutting off his own family." The room went very still. Patricia's pen stopped moving. Frank looked up from his legal pad for the first time since the meeting had begun. Warren Dodd closed his eyes briefly, the expression of a man who had just watched his client hand the opposing counsel exactly what she needed. "Mr. Calloway," Patricia said, addressing Derek by his last name for the first time. "You've just made a threatening statement in this office in front of 2 attorneys and an independent witness." Her voice was entirely calm. "I want to be certain you understand that what you said has been heard and will be documented." Derek stood up. Warren Dodd stood with him, already gathering his papers with the practiced speed of a man who knew when a meeting was over. "We're done here," Derek said. "Yes," Patricia said pleasantly. "I believe you are." They left. The conference room held its silence for a moment after the door closed. Then Frank set his pen down and looked at me. "He just handed you the harassment case on a plate," he said. "I know." My phone buzzed on the table. A message from Pinnacle Fleet Solutions sent while we had been sitting in that room. Recovery team scheduled. Asset retrieval to proceed per default protocol. I read it once. Then I looked at the calendar on Patricia's wall. 2 days left on the demand letter deadline. And somewhere across Nashville, a truck with my name on its paperwork was about to have a very different kind of visitor. Patricia called at 7 Friday morning, day 29, and asked me to come in. I was already dressed. Margaret was standing at the kitchen counter with her coffee, watching me the way she had learned to watch me over the past 5 weeks. Not with worry exactly, but with the particular attention of someone who understood that the things happening around us were moving toward a point, and that the point was close. "Today?" she asked. "Today," I said. The anti-guardianship response package had been building for 3 weeks. By the time I sat down across from Patricia that Friday morning, it was 47 pages thick and organized with the precision of a document I hoped would never need to be used, but had been built as though it certainly would. Patricia walked me through each section. The first was a letter from my primary care physician, Dr. Ellen Marsh. No relation to Helen, confirming that I had been seen twice in the past year, that my cognitive function showed no signs of impairment, and that I was fully capable of managing my own personal and financial affairs. The second section contained 12 witness statements, each one signed and dated from people who had interacted with me regularly over the past 18 months. The third was the complete video evidence package, Helen's clip, Curtis's audio, Donna's footage, all with metadata intact, all demonstrating that I had been calm, coherent, and responding appropriately to deliberate provocation. The fourth section was a chronological record of every threatening communication Derek and Emily had sent, with timestamps and context, establishing a pattern of harassment designed to undermine my credibility rather than express genuine concern for my welfare. "If they file," Patricia said, "this package goes to the court within 48 hours. A guardianship petition filed in bad faith against someone with this level of documented capacity and this level of documented harassment from the petitioners is not just likely to fail, it creates liability for the people who filed it. And if they don't file, then this sits in a drawer and you never need it." She folded her hands on the desk. "But Raymond, I want you to understand something. The fact that we built this, the fact that it exists, means that option is effectively closed to them. They know we're ready. Warren Dodd knows we're ready. And a competent attorney does not walk a client into a courtroom to file a petition they already know will fail and create blowback." I signed the final authorization page and slid it back across the desk. Patricia looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me. "Pinnacle confirmed the recovery schedule this morning. The retrieval team is moving tomorrow." She told me the time and the general location, a commercial yard on the east side of the city, where Derek's company stored equipment and vehicles. As the guarantor on the account, I had been formally notified of the recovery action, which was standard procedure. I was not required to be present, and Patricia strongly suggested I not go near the site. I told her I understood. Margaret and I drove east on Saturday morning without discussing where we were going or why. Some things don't need to be narrated between two people who have been paying attention to the same story. I parked on a side street 2 blocks from the commercial yard at 8:45, engine off, windows down to let in the warm August morning air. We didn't talk, we sat. At 9:03, a flatbed truck and a recovery vehicle turned onto the street ahead of us and continued toward the yard entrance. The Pinnacle Fleet Solutions logo was visible on the door panel of the recovery vehicle as it passed, dark lettering on a white background. Official and unremarkable, the way the machinery of consequences always looks when it finally arrives. I had expected to feel something dramatic at that moment. Triumph, maybe, or relief, or the particular satisfaction of a long calculation finally resolving. What I felt instead was something quieter and less defined, not emptiness, but a kind of stillness. the stillness of a man watching something end that had needed to end for a long time. We heard Derek before we saw him. His voice carried across the distance between the side street and the yard entrance, not words, at first just volume, the sound of someone who had walked into a situation they had not fully believed would materialize until it was standing in front of them. Then the words became clear. "You can't do this. This is my equipment. This is my business. You can't just—" A second voice, flat and professional. "Mr. Calloway, this is a standard recovery action under the terms of your lease agreement. You've received written notice of the default and the recovery schedule. We're authorized to proceed. I'm calling my attorney right now. You don't touch anything until—" "You're welcome to call your attorney, sir. The recovery will proceed while you do." A long silence. Then Derek's voice again, stripped of everything, the confidence, the performance, the carefully constructed authority he had worn since he was a teenager, standing in doorways he hadn't been invited to enter. "So, he did this," Derek said. The words were not loud. They were the words of a man talking to himself as much as anyone else. "My own father did this to me. I did not move. I did not speak. I sat in my truck on a side street 2 blocks away and listened to the sound of consequences arriving on schedule." Margaret put her hand over mine on the center console. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. At 9:27, my phone buzzed. A text from Derek sent from the yard while the recovery team worked around him. "You killed us, Dad. I hope you're proud." I set the phone in the cup holder without responding. Then I looked at the clock on the dashboard. 9:27 a.m., Saturday the 30th day. The demand letter had set a deadline of 30 days. Derek's company had had 30 days to provide documentation, to engage transparently, to find a path that didn't require anyone's name to be used without consent. 30 days to do the thing that should have been done before a single document was ever filed. The deadline had not been a threat. It had been an opportunity. They had chosen not to take it. I started the truck. Margaret was quiet beside me as I pulled away from the curb and headed back toward the west side of the city, toward the house where the garage smelled like motor oil and old rubber and 31 years of honest work, toward the life I had been building for the past 11 months. With a woman who had never once asked me to be smaller than I was. Behind us, the recovery team was doing its job. Quietly, professionally, without drama, exactly the way the best kind of work gets done. We got home at 10:10 Saturday morning. Margaret made sandwiches neither of us remembered ordering. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a few minutes, doing nothing, which was something I had not permitted myself to do in 5 weeks. Then I opened my laptop. The statement took me 40 minutes to write, and 15 minutes to cut down to something I was willing to put my name on. The final version was 112 words. I had Patricia review it by phone before I posted it. Anywhere she read it twice, suggested one word change and told me it was clean. I posted it to my personal Facebook account, which I had not used in 8 months, at 11:37 Saturday morning. It read, "For those who have reached out with concern, thank you. I want to be straightforward about what happened at my birthday party on July 5th. A banner was flown over the event containing statements designed to humiliate me and my wife in front of our friends and family. False statements were also made publicly about my wife's character. I did not respond with anger at the time, and I am not responding with anger now. I am responding with documentation. The facts speak clearly enough. I wish everyone involved well, and I ask that further contact be directed to my attorney." Attached below the statement were 3 images, a screenshot of the banner footage from Donna's clip, a photograph of the anonymous envelope with the typed message, and a single frame from Helen's video showing Derek's face turned toward his phone, smiling as the banner passed overhead. I closed the laptop. Margaret read the post on her phone and set it down without comment. We ate our sandwiches. By early afternoon, Patricia called. "The post is being shared," she said. "People who were at the party are commenting. A few are tagging others who weren't there." A pause. "Raymond, I want you to be prepared. The next 72 hours are going to be loud." She was not wrong. The calls began that evening and continued through Sunday and into Monday. A rolling tide of voices from the periphery of my life, people I hadn't spoken to in years, who had apparently been waiting for an occasion to offer their opinions. An aunt from Clarksville who said I was breaking Derek's heart. A cousin who left 3 voicemails in 4 hours. 2 men from the old congregation who said they were praying for reconciliation and then spent 10 minutes explaining why I was wrong. None of them had been at the party. All of them had apparently spoken to Emily. I answered none of the calls. Frank had said early on, do not negotiate through the wrong channels. These were not channels. These were pressure dressed up as concern, and I had learned over the past 5 weeks that pressure and concern were not the same thing, no matter how sincerely the person applying it believed otherwise. Margaret handled the ones who called her number. She was gracious and brief and said the same thing each time Raymond is working through his attorney. "We appreciate your thoughts." Then she ended the call and wrote the name down in a notebook she had started keeping on the kitchen counter. On Sunday evening, I called Patricia and asked about the employees. Derek's company had 14 people on payroll at the time the recovery action had been initiated: drivers, a dispatcher, 2 office staff, a small crew that handled equipment setup for events. None of them had had any role in the lease fraud. None of them had arranged a banner or stood at a microphone or sent threatening text messages. They had come to work every day and done their jobs and were now caught in the downstream of decisions made by people above them. Patricia explained the mechanism carefully. As part of my cooperation with Pinnacle's formal fraud investigation, I could provide a written statement clarifying which individuals I believed had knowledge of or involvement in the fraudulent documentation, and which I had no reason to believe were involved. That statement would become part of the investigative record. It would not protect anyone from consequences they had actually earned, but it would ensure that the investigation focused where the evidence pointed, rather than sweeping indiscriminately. "You're not paying their wages," Patricia said. "You're not intervening in the business. You're simply telling the truth about what you know and don't know." "That's all I've ever been doing," I said. I signed the statement Monday morning and sent it through Patricia's office. That afternoon, my phone showed 61 missed calls since Saturday. I did not count them as a victory. I counted them as noise, the particular noise that people make when they realize a situation has moved beyond the point where noise can change it, and they haven't yet accepted that fact. Emily's message arrived Monday evening from her personal number at 7:44 p.m. "You will never see your grandchild again. I want you to know that. Whatever happens with the business, whatever Derek decides, I will make sure of it. You chose this." I read it once. Then I forwarded it to Patricia with a short note for the file. "Also, can you tell me what options exist in Tennessee regarding grandparent visitation rights?" Her reply came back within the hour. In Tennessee, she explained, grandparents have the right to petition the court for reasonable visitation when that visitation has been unreasonably denied, and when visitation is determined to be in the best interest of the child. It was not an automatic right, and it required a court process, but it was a recognized legal avenue, one that Emily's threat had perhaps inadvertently just made more relevant. I set the phone down and sat in the kitchen for a while, thinking about a child who had nothing to do with any of this and everything to lose from it. Then my email notification sounded. The sender was Derek. The subject line read, "The truth about our family." I looked at it for a long moment without opening it. Whatever was inside that email, whatever version of the truth Derek had decided to commit to writing, I wanted to read it carefully, with Patricia beside me and Frank close by. Because in my experience, when someone finally decides to write down the truth, They almost always include more of it than they intended to. I opened the email at 8:15 Wednesday morning in Patricia's conference room with Frank on my left and a fresh legal pad in front of each of us. Derek's email was 4 pages long. He had written it. I guessed sometime in the small hours of Tuesday morning, the timestamp read 2:47 a.m., which was the hour when exhausted people stop calculating and start confessing. The subject line was "The Truth About Our Family," but the truth inside was less organized than that title suggested. It moved in circles the way pain moves when it hasn't found its shape yet, accusations folding into justifications, folding back into something that was almost but not quite honest. Frank read in silence. Patricia made notes in the margin of her legal pad, with the focused efficiency of someone mining a document for what it contained, rather than what it meant to say. I read every word twice. The core of it, buried under 3 pages of grievance and deflection, was this: Derek and Emily had expected me to return to the family business after Margaret and I married. Not as a partner, as a resource. My compliance background, my financial reliability, my name on their documents. They had assumed, apparently, that Margaret was a phase, that the garage and the retirement and the new life I had built were symptoms of grief rather than choices I had made deliberately. They had waited for me to come back to what they needed me to be, and when I didn't, they had decided to engineer the return. The banner Derek wrote had been Emily's idea. The public humiliation was calculated to make me feel isolated from the community I had built in Nashville, to make Margaret seem like the cause of my estrangement, and to make returning to the family dynamic feel like the path back to dignity. In Derek's words, written at 2:47 in the morning, with the armor finally off, Emily said that if we embarrassed you badly enough in front of people you respected, you'd remember where you belonged. Patricia set her pen down when she reached that section. Admission against interest, she said. This is the most powerful category of evidence in American law, a statement made voluntarily in writing that is directly contrary to the writer's own legal interests. Derek cannot claim he was pressured into writing this. He cannot claim he was misquoted. He sent it from his personal account at 2:47 in the morning, and every word of it is time-stamped and traceable. She looked at me across the table. Raymond, this email is worth more to your legal position than everything else combined. Frank nodded slowly. It's also, he said more quietly, a letter from a son who finally understood that he lost. I sat with that for a moment. The email ended with a paragraph that had clearly been written. After the rest, the tone shifted, became less organized, more raw. Derek wrote that he hadn't expected the lease investigation to go where it went. He hadn't expected Meridian to have been watching independently. He hadn't expected the recovery team to show up on a Saturday morning while he was still half convinced his father would call it off. The last sentence read, "I don't know what I expected, Dad. I think I expected you to be the person you always were. I forgot that the reason I counted on you was because you never let me down. And I used that against you." I folded the printed copy and placed it in the folder. "Forward it to your secure archive," Patricia said, "and we're done here for today." Emily came on Friday morning, day 7 after the climax, without calling the same way she had come 11 days earlier. But she looked different this time. The softness she had performed on the porch was gone. What remained was something starker and in its own way more honest. Margaret answered the door. I came to stand beside her. Emily looked at us both for a moment. Then she said without preamble, "I want you to understand something. The banner, the party, all of it, it wasn't cruelty. It was a lesson. You needed to understand what happens when you choose a stranger over your own family." The word lesson landed in the air between us. I thought about a lesson. A lesson is something a teacher gives a student. It implies authority, implies the right to instruct. Emily had stood at a microphone and made false statements about my wife in front of 90 people and called it a lesson. Emily, I said, I need you to leave. She didn't move immediately. You're going to regret cutting us off. Derek is trying and you're… Emily, my voice stayed even. Leave. She left. The door closed. Margaret and I stood in the hallway in silence for a moment. That's the closest she's ever come to admitting it, Margaret said. Could I know, I said, and it was the last thing I needed to hear. I called Patricia and reported the visit. The word lesson joined the file. That evening at 7:53 p.m. My phone showed a message from an account I didn't immediately recognize, a username that turned out to belong to a tablet registered to a child's profile, the kind of restricted account that parents set up for young children and then forget to fully monitor. The message was 6 words. Grandpa, I'm scared. Are you okay? Lucas was 9 years old. Derek and Emily's son, my grandson. A quiet boy who liked building things and asking questions about how engines worked. I had not seen him since before the birthday party. Emily's threat from Monday evening sat in my memory like a splinter I hadn't been able to locate precisely. I typed back, carefully aware that the conversation might be seen. I'm okay, buddy. Are you safe? His reply came in 2 minutes. Yes. Mom is mad. Dad is sad. I miss you. I set the phone down and looked at Margaret across the kitchen table. She had seen the exchange over my shoulder and was very still. He reached out on his own, she said. He did. Then we respond the right way. I called Patricia the following morning and asked her to begin the preliminary paperwork for a grandparent visitation petition, not to file yet, but to have it ready. I also asked her to identify a family counselor who could serve as a neutral contact point, someone Lucas could be directed toward if he needed support. That didn't require going through his parents. Patricia said she would have names by end of week. Then she asked, does he know you're working on it? I thought about the 6 words on my phone screen. Grandpa, I'm scared. Are you okay? Not yet, I said, but he will. That night, Lucas sent one more message before his tablet went offline. I want to come visit you. Can I? I looked at that sentence for a long time. Then I looked around the kitchen, the table where Margaret and I had sat, through 5 weeks of careful, exhausting, necessary work. The hallway where Emily had stood and called a betrayal a lesson. The driveway where my father had once sat in his own truck thinking about what to say. I knew sitting there that before Lucas came through that door, there was something I needed to finish first. Something in the garage with a folder that had been open for too long. The garage smelled the way it always had: motor oil, dry wood, and something I could never quite name. Maybe time. Maybe the particular weight of years spent doing honest work with both hands. I stood in the center of the space on a Thursday morning in early September, 3 weeks after the recovery team had driven away with Derek's leased equipment. Patricia had filed the grandparent visitation petition the previous Friday. Frank had helped me haul out the old metal shelving along the east wall, and now I was looking at what had always been underneath a wooden workbench my father built in 1974, solid oak, still square, still level after 51 years. I had meant to restore it for a long time. Margaret appeared in the side doorway, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She gave me one without a word. We stood together and looked at the bench. You're going to refinish it before he comes, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I said. Lucas had sent 3 texts over the past 2 weeks. The messages were short, 9-year-old short, but each one landed somewhere in my chest, like something heavy and warm arriving at the same moment. Can I see the garage? Do you still have the old socket set? Mom said maybe Saturday. Patricia had advised me to keep all contact through documented channels until the visitation order was formalized. But she had also said quietly, Raymond, the boy is reaching out. That matters in court, and it matters outside of it. The petition had been filed under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 36, 6, 306, which permits grandparents to seek visitation when a substantial relationship already exists, and severance would cause harm to the child. Patricia had submitted Helen's video, Lucas's text messages, and 3 character statements from Frank, from Donna Hartwell next door, and from the deacon at our church. She told me the hearing was set for late October. She told me she felt good about it. I sanded the workbench by hand for 2 days. Margaret brought lunch each afternoon. Frank came by Saturday morning with a can of Danish oil and helped me apply the first coat. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. On a Tuesday in mid-September, Patricia called with an update. Pinnacle completed their internal review, she said. They've formally referred the matter to their legal department and notified Meridian Commercial Credit. Raymond, both investigations are now independent of anything you do or don't do. You're a cooperating witness, not a complainant. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means you've done your part, she said. The system is doing its part now. Whatever happens next is between Derek, his lawyers, those institutions, and whatever facts exist. You are not responsible for the outcome. I sat with that for a moment. And my credit, I asked. Experian confirmed the removal of the unauthorized inquiry last week, she said. Your guarantor record at Pinnacle has been flagged as disputed pending review. Your personal credit score should reflect the correction within 30 days. I thanked her and set down the phone. Margaret was reading at the kitchen table. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the window looking out at the garage. The overhead light was still on. The workbench glowed faintly through the side window, the Danish oil catching what was left of the afternoon. Frank called that evening. You doing all right? He asked. I think so, I said. That's usually what all right sounds like, he said, and I laughed for the first time in what felt like several weeks. The visitation hearing took place on a Wednesday in late October. I wore the same jacket I had worn to my first meeting with Patricia. Margaret sat beside me. Derek and Emily were present with their attorney, Warren Dodd. Nobody spoke to each other in the hallway. Lucas was not in the room. The court had spoken with him privately, through a neutral child advocate standard procedure under Tennessee family law. The judge granted supervised visitation 2 Saturday afternoons per month at a neutral location with a family counselor present for the first 3 sessions. It wasn't everything. It was something real. Lucas arrived that first Saturday with a backpack and both hands jammed in his jacket pockets. He looked at me for a second from the bottom of the driveway, the way children look at things they're not sure are still safe. Then he said, "Is the workbench done?" "Come see for yourself," I said. He ran the flat of his hand across the oak surface the same way I had when I was roughly his age, standing beside my own father in this same building. He knocked on it twice the way you knock on something to test whether it's solid. "It's good," he said with complete authority. "Yes," I said, "it is." We spent the afternoon the way I had hoped we might. He asked questions. I answered them. Margaret brought out cookies at 2 o'clock. Frank stopped by for 20 minutes, shook Lucas's hand like he was an adult, and left without making a fuss about it. When Emily's car appeared at the end of the driveway at 4, Lucas picked up his backpack slowly. At the door, he turned around. "Grandpa," he said, "will the door be open next time?" I looked at him. 62 years old, a retired mechanic, a man who had kept every document and lost the things that couldn't be filed. I looked at this boy who had my son's jawline and apparently his own entirely separate character. "Skak," I said, "this door has always been open." He nodded once satisfied and walked down the driveway. I stood in the garage after he left and did not move for a long time. The workbench held the last of the October light. The records were all in their folders. The accounts were in order. The system was doing what systems do when given accurate information. I was 62 years old. I had built something lost Something documented everything and survived it. That is not nothing. That I decided is exactly enough. I have told you this family story, not because I wanted sympathy, but because I believe the truth earns its own audience. Here is what I know. Now standing on the other side of all of it, dignity is not something anyone can take from you with a banner, a forged signature, or 200 unanswered phone calls. I learned that slowly. I learned it the hard way. And somewhere in the middle of those 30 days, I remembered something a pastor once told me. God does not ask you to fight every battle. He asks you to stand correctly while the battle is fought. I held on to that more than I held on to any legal document. But let me be honest with you, the way I wish someone had been honest with me. Do not wait 6 weeks to call a lawyer. Do not co-sign anything you have not read 3 times. Do not assume that love in a family makes paperwork unnecessary, because when things go wrong, paperwork is the only language the system understands. I made those mistakes. You do not have to. My personal belief is simple. A grandpa story is never really about the grandfather. It is about what gets passed down, the values, the patience, the willingness to remain decent when decency is expensive. That is the only inheritance worth leaving. If this family story stayed with you, if any part of Raymond's journey felt familiar, leave a comment below and tell me why. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more grandpa stories like this, subscribe and stay close because the next one begins very soon. Thank you sincerely for following this all the way to the end. A final note. The stories ahead contain certain fictional elements constructed entirely for educational purposes. If that is not the content you are looking for, this is a good place to step away and find something that serves you better. No hard feelings. The door, as Raymond would say, is always open.